the city that spoke to stars. There are deserts that forget time, and there are deserts that remember it. Far in the southern reaches of the old world, where the Pacific hums like an endless breath, and the dunes rise and fall like sleeping waves, there once stretched a land of quiet gold and pale wind. The air there was weightless, woven with whispers of heat, and the people who lived upon that sand believed the stars were listening. Every night the dunes cooled into silver. Shadows folded neatly under the sky, and from the cliffs the faint hum of carved stones echoed like a distant flute. It was a city without noise, only the slow pulse of existence carried by the wind. That city had no name anymore. Time, in its patient mercy, had softened its syllables. But the ancients once called it the place that waits for dawn. And among its people lived a young woman named Nayara, the daughter of an astronomer, born beneath a night of double moons and sea breeze. She grew in silence, listening more than she spoke. Her eyes were always raised upward, tracing patterns no one else could see. Each evening, before the horizon folded into dusk, Nayara would climb to the flat roof of her father's house. The stones there were warm with day, cool with twilight. She carried with her a single polished shell, a listening shell, carved by her grandfather from river bone. She'd place it against her ear and wait. The world seemed still then, the kind of stillness that isn't empty but full of murmurs, breaths, and the soft hum of stars exhaling light across distances too wide to imagine. Her people believed that when the desert grew completely silent, one could hear the sky speak, not with words, but with tones, deep, low, like the beating of the earth's hidden heart. Nayara's father, the master of alignments, said that the stars were the oldest memory of creation, that their light carried stories from before the world had sand or sea. His hands were always dusted with fine powder from the stone mirrors he used to chart the heavens. When Nayara was small, he'd lift her up to see the reflections, constellations dancing upon surfaces smooth as water. She remembered asking, "Do the stars see us back?" And he had smiled, a quiet, sun-worn smile. "They do, little one, but they see slowly. It takes them thousands of heartbeats to notice." That was many seasons ago. Now, her father's hair was turning the color of ash, and the city was changing too. The river that once curved near their walls had thinned into a ribbon of salt. The wind had grown drier, carrying fewer voices. Still, every night, Nayara listened. When the moon rose high, its reflection shimmered across the city's stone lines, avenues laid in patterns that mimicked the constellations above. The people had built their homes, their courtyards, even their burial grounds to mirror the heavens. They believed harmony between sky and earth kept the world alive. And yet, lately, Nayara felt a strange ache in the silence, as if the stars had paused mid-sentence. Tonight, the sky was unusually clear. The air trembled with heat that had not yet cooled. As she leaned on the parapet, the shell pressed to her ear. She heard a sound, faint, like wind brushing across distant stone. Not the usual breathing of the desert, but something layered, resonant. She opened her eyes, searching the dark horizon. Above her, Orion's pattern, the hunter they called Kahira, gleamed faintly red. But one of his stars flickered, unevenly, as if unsure of its place. Her breath slowed. She waited. Then the sound deepened, a low hum beneath the silence, a rhythm almost too slow to be called music. It was not frightening. It felt like recognition, as though the earth were remembering a voice it had once forgotten. The hum lasted a few breaths, then faded, leaving only the night. Nayara didn't move. The stars above seemed to lean closer, their light bending slightly toward her face. And far below, beneath layers of sand and time, something shifted softly, like a sleeper turning in a dream. This was how it began, in the hush between the star's breath and the desert's reply. No thunder, no omen. There are deserts that sleep, and there are deserts that dream. This one dreamed in whispers, long, steady sighs of wind brushing over dunes that had not moved in centuries. When the sun fell behind the far ridges and the last lines of gold dissolved into twilight, the air would cool and stretch, and for a moment the whole world would seem to hold its breath. It was in that hush that the ancient city awoke, not in noise or light, but in awareness. The people called their home Kanti, meaning the place that waits for dawn. Its walls were made from stones, the color of moonlight and ochre, carved smooth by sand and time. The streets were not built at random. Each curve, each courtyard, each column aligned with the constellations above. The entire city was a reflection of the night sky, drawn upon the earth as a prayer of harmony. And above it all, on the highest terrace of the desert, a small house watched the horizon. Within that house lived Nayara, daughter of the master of alignments. From her earliest years, she was taught that the stars were not just lights, but voices. Her father said they hummed through the air, through stone and bone, through every breath. To hear them required stillness, not of the body, but of thought. So every night, when the world grew quiet, Nayara would climb the roof with her polished shell, lie down beneath the cooling sky, and listen. Tonight, the wind was soft, a slow tide of warmth rolling through the desert's emptiness. She watched the stars emerge one by one, shyly at first, then in clusters. They were not fixed points to her. They moved, pulsed, shimmered with subtle rhythm. It felt as though the heavens were breathing. Her father's voice, low and steady, returned to her memory. The stars do not rise for us. They turn to remind us that the sky has its own heart. We merely echo it. She smiled faintly, tracing her finger across the cold surface of a nearby mirror stone. Its surface reflected the constellations above, bending them into a pattern, one that she had memorized since childhood. But something was changing. The patterns no longer matched the diagrams etched upon her father's walls. The heavens had shifted ever so slightly. One of the guiding stars, the one they called Kahira's heart, no longer sat at the center of their celestial map. It had moved, faintly but undeniably. She whispered to herself, as though the stars could hear, "You've wandered too far tonight." And as the words left her lips, the desert seemed to breathe back, a low hum rolling beneath the surface. Nayara stilled. The sound was deep, almost like distant thunder, but slower, warmer. It didn't frighten her. Instead, it filled her with the feeling that she was being answered. The next morning, the city stirred in its slow rhythm. There were no hurried steps in the people believed that haste was a way of angering the gods of air. Artisans moved through the courtyards, carrying dyed fabrics that shimmered like dawnlight. Potters turned clay with patient hands, singing under their breath. Children chased shadows along the mosaic tiles that traced the paths of stars. The desert itself gleamed faintly, the sand holding fragments of mica and crystal that caught the light like tiny mirrors. It was said that this desert had once been the floor of the sky before it fell gently to earth. Nayara found her father Eshin, in the courtyard of alignments. He stood before a row of bronze instruments, their edges marked with tiny carvings, measurements of the heavens. He was drawing a line from one mirror to another with a slender rod of gold, adjusting its angle by a fraction. His face, sun-worn and calm, was a map of decades spent under the open sky. Without turning, he spoke. "You were listening again last night." Nayara smiled. "Always," he nodded. "Did the stars say something new?" She hesitated, then said softly. One of them moved, the heart of Kahira. That made him pause. His hands stilled over the mirrors. Moved, yes, only slightly. But the reflection is no longer true. Her father looked toward the horizon. The morning light washed over the dunes in a pale shimmer. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "it is not the star that moves, but the mirror that forgets." She tilted her head, curious. He explained, "The earth breathes too, my child. The stones shift, the air bends the light. The world is not as still as we imagine." Still, his eyes lingered on the mirror's surface longer than usual. A thought passed through him, quiet but unsettled. That evening, as the last colors of dusk bled away, a group of elders gathered in the observatory. It was a circle of open pillars and stone altars, surrounded by hundreds of tiny mirrors embedded into the floor. The mirrors caught starlight and redirected it into patterns that changed with the seasons. The city's belief was simple. When the stars and the stones fell into perfect harmony, the world's spirit remained calm. When the alignment faltered, imbalance would ripple across their lives. Eshin and Nayara stood among the gathered astronomers as the sky grew dense with constellations. The elders murmured as they compared the reflections on the floor with the carvings etched on ancient tablets. Something was wrong. The lines did not meet as they should. The central star, Kahira's heart, was indeed out of place. One of the older priests whispered, "The sky is ill." Another said, "Or we have forgotten how to listen." The wind rose, carrying a thin cry of sand against stone. The torches flickered, then steadied again. Eshin closed his eyes, breathing deeply. "It is only a drift," he said, his tone calm. "Perhaps the sky is simply reminding us to realign our hearts." But days passed. The city went on as usual, calm, ceremonial, unhurried. But small things began to shift. The wells ran shallower. The songbirds that visited from the coast stopped coming. At night, the air felt heavier, thick with unseen breath. Nayara spent more time in the observatory, charting the heavens, noting each subtle change. She traced the paths of the stars on clay tablets, and every night she found the same. Kahira's heart continued to drift, pulling the constellation along with it, distorting the pattern that guided the city's calendar. Her father, though gentle, grew quieter. He began visiting the old chambers beneath the observatory, places built by their ancestors centuries before. She followed him once, silently down the spiral steps into the cool depths below the sand. There, torches lit walls covered in carvings, spirals, eyes, lines of light converging into circles. And in the center stood something she had never seen, a vast disk of stone, polished to a mirror finish, angled upward through a narrow shaft that opened to the night sky. Her father called it the heart mirror. It was said that through this mirror, the first astronomers of Kante heard the voice of the stars. The shaft above was aligned to the constellation Kahira, allowing its light to touch the mirror on the longest night of the year. Eshin approached it with reverence, his steps soundless. He whispered, "This is where the silence began." Nayara asked softly, Can it still speak? He smiled faintly. Perhaps it never stopped. That night, Nayara could not sleep. She lay on the roof, listening to the desert's breath. The stars seemed restless, twinkling faster, as if whispering secrets too quickly to understand. She pressed the shell to her ear. This time, the hum came clearer, deeper, rhythmic, like the sound of a distant ocean beneath the ground. And then, for a heartbeat, she heard something else layered beneath it, a faint, melodic tone, almost like a voice singing far away. She sat up, her heart steady but curious. Was it her imagination, the wind, or something older, traveling through stone and air to reach her ear? The song faded slowly, leaving her surrounded by silence again. Above, the stars shimmered. Below, the desert listened. The following morning, she went to her father and said, "I think the desert is singing." Eshin looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if he had been waiting for her to say it. "You've heard it, then you have to." He smiled gently. "Since I was your age, it comes only when the stars shift. The elders call it the breathing of the deep. They say it's the sound of the world, remembering its origin." Nayara felt a calm curiosity bloom inside her. "What does it remember?" "Light," he said softly. "Everything begins with light." He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the dunes rippled like sleeping giants. "Someday," he continued, "you'll follow the sound, but not yet. The stars must finish their sentence first." And so she waited. The days grew longer, the nights clearer. The city continued to align its life by the heavens. The people sang, worked, slept, unaware that above them, the patterns they trusted were slowly unraveling. But Nayara felt no fear, only awe. Each night she listened, and the hum grew stronger, weaving itself into her dreams. It was as though the earth itself was speaking in a language made of distance and memory. She began to write what she heard, not in words, but in patterns, tracing spirals and dots that echoed the rhythm of the tone. Her father watched silently, recognizing in her what he had once felt, that quiet pull toward something eternal. One evening, as the sun fell and shadows stretched across the city's mirrored streets, Nayara climbed the observatory steps alone. The wind had died. The air was completely still. The first stars blinked awake, and she closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The hum came again, low, steady. She opened her palms and felt the vibration through the stone beneath her fingers. The desert, she thought, is alive. And for the first time, she whispered not to the stars, but to the sand below her feet. "I'm listening." A breeze stirred, light as breath. The stars shimmered brighter, as if approving. And in that moment, under the vast silence of the world, Nayara felt herself becoming part of both the sky above and the earth below, two halves of one ancient rhythm. The city that waited for dawn was listening again. The chapter closes in quiet, the wind quietly, like a secret remembered too late. There were no cries of roosters here, no clamor of markets, only the long, slow breath of the desert as the light climbed from pale silver to soft gold. Dew never visited this land, only thin threads of haze that curled upward from the dunes and vanished before the sun touched them. Nayara awoke with the sound of sand brushing stone. She had dreamt again, though it felt less like a dream and more like remembering something she had never lived. In her sleep, she saw patterns of light, vast and moving, shifting above an endless plain of mirrors. Each star hummed, each note flowing into another, forming a music that filled the space between her breaths. When she opened her eyes, the music was gone. but its calm lingered, a weightless stillness resting behind her ribs. She rose, washed her face in cool water from a clay bowl, and stepped out onto the terrace. The horizon shimmered faintly. The dunes were almost white under the early light, the wind still asleep. In the distance, she could see the towers of Conte glinting faintly, small domes and walls catching the dawn in fragments, as though the city itself were waking with her. Her father was already in the courtyard, studying the reflection of the sky in a bronze basin filled with water. He turned slightly as she approached. "You dreamed again," he said softly. Nayara nodded. The stars were singing. He smiled faintly. "They always are, but their music, it's changing. The tones are breaking apart." Eshan lowered his gaze to the basin. The reflection rippled with his breath. "The elders say the heavens move in circles of centuries. What you hear may be the world shifting its song." She knelt beside him. "Do you hear it too?" His answer was a long silence, the kind of silence that wasn't refusal, but remembrance. "Finally," he said, "when I was your age, I did. Then life filled my ears with other sounds." Nayara touched the surface of the water. The reflection trembled and scattered, the stars mirrored there. "Maybe the stars speak only to those who still listen," she whispered. He looked at her, his expression half pride, half melancholy. "Then keep listening, my child. One day the silence will tell you what it means." Later that day, Nayara walked through the southern edge of the city, where sand met the carved terraces of stone. The desert stretched endlessly beyond, but here, beneath the surface, ran a network of old tunnels. The people of Conti believed those tunnels were the veins of the earth, carrying the whispers of distant winds. She followed one of the passages downward. The air grew cooler, and the scent of mineral dust filled her lungs. Faint light filtered through holes above, casting narrow beams across the walls. Ancient carvings traced the stones, spirals, eyes, and what looked like waves or threads weaving together. In one alcove, she found a carving she hadn't seen before, a pattern of lines intersecting like the points of a constellation. Beneath it, symbols read, "When the sky forgets its song, the earth will remind it." She lingered there, fingertips resting on the etchings. The words felt older than the city itself, carved by hands that had known the same stillness she now felt. When she emerged back into the sunlight, the world above seemed louder, though still hushed compared to any other civilization. A group of children were drawing lines in the sand, mimicking the constellations with shells and pebbles. The air smelled faintly of dried herbs, the kind used for ritual burning at twilight. She smiled at their game, at the gentle repetition of belief passed from one generation to another. That evening, the observatory filled with golden light. The elders gathered again, not in worry, but in ritual. It was the season of offerings, when they gave thanks to the sky for another cycle of balance. The city's musicians arrived first, flutists with instruments carved from condor bone, drummers with soft hides that echoed like heartbeats. The air shimmered with slow melodies. Women carried bowls of crushed mica, scattering it across the ground until it sparkled like starlight. Nayara stood beside her father as he raised his hands to the heavens. His voice was calm, melodic, carrying across the open space. "O lights of the high wind, we remember your rhythm, we echo your silence. Teach us again the balance of the night." As he spoke, Nayara felt something move within her, not emotion, but awareness. The stars above seemed closer tonight, their light more concentrated, their patterns denser. And then, In the midst of the music and prayers, she heard it again, the hum. It came faintly at first, from beneath her feet, rising through the stone floor, the same tone that had called to her before, but this time layered multiple harmonies, weaving together like threads. She closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her chest. It wasn't frightening, it was vast, calm, infinite. And then she realized the tone wasn't steady. It faltered, it trembled, as though something in its harmony had cracked. When she opened her eyes, the stars seemed to blur. The edges of constellations wavered, their lines misaligning by fractions. The musicians paused, sensing the shift though they could not name it. Her father looked upward, his brow furrowing slightly, but his voice did not break. He continued the prayer, steady, grounding. After the ritual ended, the people dispersed with quiet murmurs. The air was heavy, though no one would say it aloud. Nayara. In the following days, subtle unease spread through the city's rhythm. Not fear, not panic, just hesitation. Artisans paused longer before beginning their work. Farmers looked up from their fields more often than down. The animals grew restless at night, wandering toward the dunes. Nayara recorded everything, the angles, the changes, the tones she heard through her shell. Her father's journals began filling faster. He rarely spoke, but she could feel the weight of thought pressing behind his eyes. One evening, she found him on the terrace, long after sunset, staring not at the sky, but at the sand. "Father," he did not look up. "Do you know what makes the stars move, Nayara?" She hesitated, their path through the sky. He shook his head slowly. "No, it is not movement we see, but memory. We are watching ancient light, still traveling. When we look up, we are seeing what was, not what is." She sank beside him. The air was cool now, filled with the faint scent of salt carried from the distant coast. He continued, "If the stars seem to break apart, it may not be the heavens changing, but our memory losing shape." Nayara whispered, "Then the world forgets its song." Eshin turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is learning a new one." They sat together in silence, watching the desert fade into the silver of night. A week later, a sandstorm approached from the west, the first in many seasons. The people of Conti sealed their windows, covered their mirrors, and whispered blessings to the wind. Nayara stood at the doorway of their home, watching as the horizon vanished behind the pale veil of dust. The sky dimmed, the air pulsed with static. The storm arrived like a slow tide, not fierce, but steady. Grains of sand whispered against the walls, swirling in eddies. The world turned into an ocean of muted gold. Through it all, Nayara listened. Beneath the wind's roar, she could hear it again, the tone, the voice beneath the storm, steady and low, unbroken by chaos. Hours passed. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm began to ease. When the air cleared, the city glowed faintly, the mirrors washed clean by sand, catching starlight again. The heavens looked sharper, their edges clearer, their distances suddenly intimate. Nayara stepped outside, her footprints filled instantly with silver dust. Above her Kahira's heart, the wandering star shone brighter than all the others. For a moment, she thought she saw it pulse, once, twice, as if answering. The tone beneath her feet deepened, harmonizing, and she realized the sky was no longer silent. It was speaking again, not in the same language as before, but something new, something that sounded like the beginning of understanding. The people of Conti slept that night, unaware of what stirred above them. But Nayara remained awake, sitting by the heart mirror below the observatory. She traced her hand along its cold surface, feeling the vibration echo through her palm. She spoke softly, not as a question, but as a greeting. "I can hear you." The reflection shimmered faintly. A flicker of light passed through the shaft above, illuminating the chamber for just an instant. Nayara smiled, not out of wonder, but belonging. The stars had not broken their song. They had only changed their rhythm. And somewhere, the next morning arrived, not with sunlight, but with silver. The air over Conti had turned translucent, touched by the residue of the night storm. Every surface shimmered faintly as though dusted with light. When the first rays of dawn struck the city, they did not scatter. They flowed, sliding over the stones like slow water. Nayara stood on the upper terrace, wrapped in her light shawl, watching the distant dunes undulate in quiet rhythm. Beneath her feet, the earth felt still, yet within that stillness was a hum, the faint memory of sound that now lingered everywhere. The tone had not faded with the night. It was softer now, woven into the air, a harmony just beyond hearing. She closed her eyes. It was as if the city breathed with her. Behind her, a voice spoke gently. "You did not sleep." Her father's tone held neither reproach nor concern, only the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had stayed awake many nights himself. Nayara turned slightly. I listened. Eshin walked beside her, his robes brushing the floor. He looked to the horizon, then upward. The stars seemed clearer today. "They sound clearer too," she whispered, as if the storm washed their voices. He smiled faintly. Perhaps the heavens needed silence to speak again. They stood together, the morning wind wrapping around them like a slow breath. After a long pause, Nayara said, "I think the tones form a pattern, like a map." Ession's eyes flickered with quiet curiosity. "Show me." That afternoon, Nayara brought out her scrolls, sheets of thin parchment, layered with charcoal dots and faint blue lines. She had marked each tone she'd heard during the nights, each interval of pitch corresponding to a constellation she could identify. She spread the scroll across the floor of the observatory, its edges curling slightly. Light from the open dome fell across it like a river of white. Ession knelt beside her. His fingers traced the arcs and intersections. They follow the motion of Kahira's heart. "Yes," Nayara said softly, "but not in the way the elders chart it. The tones rise and fall at times when the star appears still. It's not about what we see, it's about what we hear." He looked at her, studying her calm intensity. "So, the sound is another form of light, or light is another form of sound," she replied. Eshin smiled faintly. "That would make the universe a song written in silence." Nayara nodded, tracing the pattern again. When the tones broke apart, it felt like part of the melody went missing. But after the storm, I heard something return, a deeper note. It connected the others, as if completing a circle. Her father leaned closer. "Where does it lead?" She pointed to the center of her map. "Here, beneath Conti, at twilight, they descended into the lower chambers, where the oldest stones of the city lay, untouched by recent generations. The walls bore carvings, so worn that meaning had become suggestion. Every corner held the scent of sand and mineral, old as memory itself. They carried a single lamp, its flame trembling in the thin air. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly. The chamber at the end of the passage was round, with a domed ceiling etched in concentric circles. In the center lay a flat slab of black stone, smooth as glass, surrounded by smaller stones marked with ancient runes. Nayara approached it slowly. The air above the slab seemed to shimmer faintly, though no heat touched it. This, she murmured, is the point the tones converged toward. Her father knelt beside her, brushing the surface with his hand. This isn't natural stone. It's polished obsidian, the same used in the first mirrors. Nayara listened. Beneath their silence, she could hear it, a low hum, steady and even, not from the air, but from below the stone itself. It's singing, she whispered. Eshin closed his eyes. Yes, but it's a song too slow for most to notice. Days turned into quiet study. They mapped the tones as they changed, aligning them with the constellations overhead. What they discovered was unlike anything recorded, not random, not chaotic, but rhythmic. A vast, slow pattern that repeated over decades, shaping the placement of stars, dunes, and the very paths of the winds. When Nayara traced it onto a larger scroll, the pattern resembled not a sky map, but something terrestrial, the outline of valleys, rivers, and mountains. Her father stared at it for a long time. "This is not the sky," he murmured. "It's the earth reflected upward." Nayara nodded. "The stars mirror the land." They realized then that Kanti had been built on a point where both maps, celestial and terrestrial, intersected perfectly. The city was not random. It was a translation, a place where heaven and earth whispered to each other through silence. That night, Nayara climbed the tower alone. The desert stretched outward, its sands glowing faintly in starlight. The storm had passed, leaving ripples and waves that seemed to breathe. She held the bronze shell in her hands and lifted it toward the sky. The tone vibrated softly. "Kahira's heart," she whispered. "If you're listening, I understand now." She felt warmth against her palms. Not heat, but resonance. The air trembled faintly. And then, faintly, beautifully, another tone joined. Higher, slower, older. It was not coming from above. It was rising from beneath the ground. The two notes met, merged, and for a moment, the air between them became still, a bridge of quiet, where the stars appeared motionless, the sands unbroken. Then the tones parted gently, leaving only the wind. Nayara lowered wind-dried herbs. Children practiced drawing constellations in dust. Travelers arrived from the coast, bringing shells and silk dyed with crushed petals. Life continued, tranquil and unhurried. But Nayara's world grew deeper. She began recording not just the stars, but the spaces between them, the silence that framed their light. One evening, she brought her notes to her father. "If the stars mirror the land," she said, "then what lies beyond the dunes might echo what lies beyond the visible sky." Eshin smiled, his eyes soft with quiet understanding. "Then we must travel beyond the known horizon." She looked up at him, the idea vast and calm within her. "To follow the map beneath our feet." He nodded. "Yes, to listen where no one else remembers." That night, she dreamed of the city, not as stone and sand, but as sound. Every dome, every wall, every corridor resonated with a tone, forming a living chord. Above it all, Kahira's heart pulsed like a steady drum, binding them together. When she awoke, the echo of that harmony lingered, gentle as breath. She rose before dawn and stepped onto the terrace. The stars were dimming now, yielding to the first light of day. Yet she felt no loss, only continuity. She whispered, almost to herself, "The map is not of where to go, but how to listen." The wind carried her words across the desert, dissolving them into the distance. Far below, beneath the stone chamber where the obsidian slab lay, the faint hum deepened. No one in the city could hear it, save Nayara. It was the earth's way of answering, not with words. There is a kind of dawn that comes without color, a dawn that arrives not through light but through sound, the distant murmur of air shifting, the soft awakening of things that never truly slept. That was the dawn over Kanti when Nayara and Ishan left the city. The gates opened with slow grace, their hinges whispering against stone. Behind them, the city gleamed faintly, its towers wrapped in a pale haze, its mirrors catching the last fragments of starlight. Ahead, the desert stretched wide, not barren, but alive with quiet patterns of wind and reflection. Each grain of sand seemed to shimmer with memory. They carried little water, dried roots, a small drum made of hide to mark rhythm when walking through silence. And Nayara carried the bronze shell, wrapped carefully in woven silk. No one asked where they were going. The people of Kanti had always understood that journeys guided by stillness were not to be questioned. Eshin walked a few steps ahead, his staff leaving faint imprints that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Nayara followed, her gaze fixed on the shifting horizon. After a long silence, she said, "It feels as if we are walking across time." Eshin nodded. "We are. The sands remember everything." By midday, the wind grew soft and warm. The dunes took on a golden hue, folding into one another like gentle waves. The path they followed was invisible, only a line of thought, guided by tone rather than direction. Every few hours, Nayara would stop, press the bronze shell to her ear, and listen. Sometimes she heard nothing, sometimes a faint hum, like the echo of a note long faded. Each time, she marked it in her journal, not as distance, but as resonance. "The tone grows deeper here," she murmured at one point, her brow calm, "as if the earth thickens beneath us." Essien looked at her thoughtfully. "The heart of sound lies in stillness. Perhaps we are approaching a place that holds the silence itself." That evening, they reached a plateau of pale stone, wide, flat, and smooth as though shaped by an unseen hand. From its center, a shallow depression extended outward in a long curve, as though a river had once flowed there. Nayara knelt beside it, brushing her fingers through the fine dust. "There's no water," she said softly, "but it feels like a river." Essien nodded, his gaze following the invisible current. A river of silence. As twilight descended, the stars reappeared, faint at first, then vivid and near. Their reflections shimmered across the stone surface, forming lines that curved exactly along the dry river's path. Nayara stood, holding the shell to her ear. The tone returned, low, slow, steady. It moved like water. She followed it, tracing the invisible stream until the sound deepened. At one point, she stopped abruptly. "Here," she whispered. Beneath her feet, the ground felt hollow. Essien tapped his staff gently against the stone. The echo was soft, resonant, their space below. He knelt, brushed away the dust, and revealed a faint circular outline, the edge of a sealed passage, covered for centuries by wind. Nayara looked at her father, her expression serene. The river doesn't flow above. It flows beneath. They worked quietly through the night, clearing the entrance with care. The stars drifted overhead like patient witnesses. When the first light of dawn returned, a small opening appeared, enough for a single person to slip through. Essien lowered a lantern first, its glow trembling faintly as it descended. Beneath them stretched a corridor carved of smooth stone, its walls etched with faint spirals that glimmered when the light passed over them. Nayara felt her heart slow, not from fear, but from awe. It's older than Kantai, she murmured. Her father's voice was soft, much older. They descended slowly, their movements measured, their breaths sinking with the hum beneath their feet. The corridor opened into a vast chamber. Unlike the observatory above, this one was not aligned to the sky, but to the earth. Its ceiling was low, shaped like the inside of a wave. The walls shimmered with a substance like polished quartz, catching the lamplight in soft, translucent hues. In the center stood a basin, wide and shallow, filled not with water, but with fine, silvery dust. Eshin approached first, brushing his fingertips along the rim. "It's not ash," he said softly. "It's ground crystal." Nayara watched the dust shift faintly, as if stirred by an invisible current. "It's listening," she said. They stood in silence. The faint hum returned, not from the walls now, but from the basin itself. Eshin turned slowly, observing the markings along the chamber's edge. They formed a continuous line, looping around like the trace of a flowing river. But instead of depicting water, the carvings showed waves of sound, ripples, circles, overlapping tones. He whispered, this was their river. Nayara closed her eyes, a river that carried sound instead of water. She knelt and placed the bronze shell into the basin. The hum deepened, the dust shifting. They watched as the ripples formed and faded, their silence filled only by the rhythm of their breathing. When the last ring dissolved, the basin stilled again, but in its center, faintly glimmering beneath the dust, was a single symbol, the mark of a hand with a star resting in its palm. Essien reached out, but did not touch it. "This is the same mark found beneath the city's oldest stones." Nayara nodded. Then Kanti was not the beginning. It was built upon something older, something that taught our ancestors how to listen. Essien's voice was low, reverent. Perhaps this place was where the first silence was shaped. They remained in the chamber for hours, listening. The air was cool, the stillness absolute, not empty, but full of unseen presence. Every whisper of movement carried weight, like part of a song waiting for its next note. When they finally ascended, the desert above glowed faintly under the moon. The stars shimmered with clarity. Nayara looked toward Kahira's heart. Its light pulsed once, steady, slow. She smiled softly. "The sky is remembering," Essien nodded, "and the earth is responding." They began walking back toward the dunes, their footsteps quiet, leaving no mark behind. By dawn, they reached a ridge overlooking the desert plain. From there, the shapes of the dunes formed lines, faint but unmistakable. To the untrained eye, it was only sand, but to Nayara, it was a vast design, a mirror of the constellations above, drawn by the wind and light. She pressed her palm against the ground. The hum rose again, slow and deep. "This is the river," she whispered. "It flows through silence, connecting everything that listens." Her father looked out across the endless expanse, his expression calm and full of quiet wonder. "Then Kanti is only one shore," Nayara nodded, "and we have only begun to hear." The wind passed over them, soft as breath. The dunes shimmered faintly. Far, the desert, at dawn, resembled a vast breathing sea. Each dune rose and fell with slow rhythm, a tide of gold and silence. For days, Nayara and her father walked across that shifting expanse. They followed no visible path, only the faint resonance beneath their feet, a low vibration that pulsed like a distant heartbeat. Sometimes it would vanish entirely, leaving only the sigh of wind. Other times, it would return with a depth that made their bones tremble softly, as if the world itself was humming in sleep. Essien called it the voice of the deep earth. Nayara called it the memory that still sings. Their pace was unhurried. Every few hours they stopped to rest, to draw patterns in the sand, to watch the stars fade or return. The desert rewarded slowness. It revealed meaning only to those who moved gently. At night, they made small fires of dried roots that burned without smoke. The flames flickered in steady rhythm, swaying with the same pulse that lived in the sands. One night, while Essien slept, Nayara sat alone, watching the horizon. The stars hung low, almost near enough to touch. Kahira's heart gleamed brighter than ever, a steady ember in the still sky. She lifted the bronze shell to her ear. The hum was softer now, but clearer. And then, for the first time, she heard something new. Not just tone, but layers of tone. A pattern, a rhythm, a call, and an answer. She listened closely. It wasn't words. It wasn't music. It was something deeper, a structure. She began to trace it with her finger on the sand, marking intervals where the pitch shifted, where silence fell. When she finished, she saw it formed a pattern like waves converging on a single point. She whispered to herself, an echo returning. When she looked up, the stars above seemed to mirror the lines she'd drawn, as if the sky itself was responding to her listening. The following morning, she showed the markings to her father. Essien studied them silently for a long while. "This shape," he said at last. "It resembles the designs on the first stones of Conti's foundation. But those were carved thousands of years ago." Nayara looked toward the west. "Then we're walking toward what they once heard." They continued their journey, the dunes slowly shifting beneath the light. By evening, the hum grew stronger again, steady and resonant. The air itself seemed to vibrate, the sand trembling faintly as though remembering sound. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them dipped, a hollow sound, soft, deep, like a sigh from under the world. They stopped. Essien knelt, brushing away sand with slow hands. Beneath the surface lay something hard, smooth, curved, and cold. They cleared the area together, and a faint dome began to appear, a perfect hemisphere buried under centuries of wind. Its surface shimmered faintly, even in the fading light. Nayara ran her fingers across it. It's stone, but polished like a mirror. Essien pressed his ear gently to the dome. His eyes widened slightly. "It's resonating." Nayara knelt beside him. By twilight, they had uncovered an entrance, a small arch sealed with hardened mineral deposits. They broke through carefully, the stone cracking open with the faintest sigh, like a long-held breath released. Inside was cool, dry air. The walls shimmered faintly, not from reflection, but from the minerals embedded within them. They lit a lantern and stepped in. The chamber was circular, its center dominated by a series of thin columns arranged like the spokes of a great wheel. Between them, strands of crystalline thread stretched taut, each one vibrating faintly. Nayara whispered, "It's an instrument." Essien nodded slowly, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "A listening temple." She stepped closer, holding her hand near one of the threads. The vibration pulsed through her skin, not sound exactly, but sensation. Each thread was tuned differently, forming layers of resonance that filled the space with invisible rhythm. When she moved between them, the air shifted gently, as if the entire chamber responded to her presence. "This is how they heard the world," Essien murmured, "not through words or sight, but through vibration." Nayara closed her eyes. The tones wove around her like breath. "It's beautiful," she whispered. It feels alive. For hours, they sat within the chamber, saying nothing. The hum of the strings changed subtly as the night deepened, responding to the cooling air, to the pulse of the desert above. At one point, Eshin softly struck his staff against the floor. The sound echoed upward, meeting the threads. The vibration spread outward in perfect circles, each resonance adding to the next, forming a harmonic wave that filled the chamber with light. Not bright light, just a soft, phosphorescent glow, as if the very air had begun to remember its own brilliance. Nayara's breath slowed. The glow pulsed gently, fading and returning in rhythm with her heartbeat. She felt as though the boundaries between herself, the stone, and the air had blurred, all part of a single, breathing silence. When the light dimmed, Essien spoke softly. These people, whoever they were, didn't look for meaning in the stars. They listened for it in the spaces between. Nayara opened her eyes, her voice almost a whisper. They turned the world into an echo. Before dawn, they climbed to the surface again. The air was cool, almost transparent. The dunes around them glowed faintly under the starlight. Eshin sat quietly, gazing at the horizon. Every sound leaves an imprint, he said. Even silence carries memory. What we found here might be the first memory of the earth itself. Nayara nodded, her tone calm, and we're its echo. They sat there until the first light touched the dunes. The desert shimmered like a sea of slow fire, and from somewhere beneath their feet, the hum continued, unbroken, eternal. Nayara placed her palm on the sand, her fingers trembling slightly. When they left the listening temple behind, the desert seemed quieter than before, not empty, but attentive. It was as though every grain of sand now held memory, waiting for them to move, to breathe, to stir it into sound again. Essien walked slightly ahead, his shadow long in the dawn light. Nayara followed, her feet sinking softly into the cool dunes. The air shimmered faintly, the horizon rippling like a veil of liquid glass. The sun rose higher, but something unusual began to happen. Their shadows began to fade. At first, it was just the light, too strong, too evenly spread to cast a clear outline. But as the day deepened, the phenomenon became undeniable. They looked down and saw only faint traces of darkness where their bodies should have blocked the sun. Nayara held up her hand. No shadow formed on the sand. "Father," she said quietly, "the light here, it doesn't fall." Eshin turned slowly, his expression calm but watchful. He lifted his staff, rotating it gently. The wood caught the light, yet threw none back. "This isn't the desert we crossed," he murmured. "Something has changed in the air." They moved forward cautiously, the heat soft and dry, but not oppressive. Ahead, the dunes began to level out into a plain of smooth, pale stone, and there, half buried beneath layers of fine dust, lay the outlines of walls, vast, circular, radiating outward like ripples frozen in time. The city revealed itself gradually, like a mirage that didn't vanish. Its architecture was unlike Conti's. There were no towers, no sharp corners. Everything curved, walls flowing into arches, arches into domes, domes into terraces that shimmered faintly as they breathed. What struck them most was the light. It was everywhere, not harsh, but diffused. It seemed to emerge from the stone itself, glowing softly from within, rather than shining from above. Essien whispered, "The city without shadows." Nayara looked around, her voice reverent. "Maybe the light here isn't something you see. Maybe it's something you remember." They stepped carefully between the structures, the ground humming with a tone that changed with each step, faint musical notes, as though the city still sang to itself in sleep. At the city's center stood a wide basin, filled not with water, but with glassy dust. When the wind passed over it, the surface rippled faintly, and faint images shimmered within reflections of faces, fragments of moments. Nayara knelt beside it. "Father, it's showing things that aren't here." Essien crouched, studying the surface. "Reflections of memory," he said softly. "The people who once lived here might have shaped light the way we shape clay." Nayara watched the shifting forms, children running, women carrying pottery, a man gazing toward a horizon that no longer existed. Their faces were serene, unafraid. As the wind slowed, the images faded. Only the gentle hum of the stone remained. They found shelter beneath a broken arch and rested. Eshin unrolled his notes, tracing the symbols he had copied from the listening temple. If the first city heard the earth, perhaps this one learned to hear light. "Father," she said after a pause, "what if they weren't trying to worship the stars, or the sun, or even the ground beneath them, but to understand how everything listens back?" Essien smiled faintly, his eyes warm. "Then we are following not a path, but an echo of listening itself." That night, the sky above the city was unlike any other. The stars appeared closer, almost within reach. Their light didn't fall straight, it bent, curved gently around the stone towers, dancing across surfaces that glowed faintly from within. Nayara lay on her back, her head resting on her hands. "Do you hear it?" she asked. Eshan listened. The night was utterly still, no wind, no shifting sand. Yet, beneath the silence, there was a tone, faint, fluid, endless. "It's the same hum," he said quietly, "but slower, like the breath of something enormous." Nayara's voice was distant, drowsy. "Maybe the desert itself is asleep. Maybe we're walking through its dream." In the early hours before dawn, Nayara awoke to faint movement. The light on the horizon was pale blue, softer than moonlight, brighter than starlight. From the basin at the city's heart, a faint mist began to rise. Within it, she saw shifting shapes, outlines of figures, walking slowly through the light. Not ghosts, not visions, echoes, repeating old motions, ancient gestures. She didn't feel fear, only stillness. When she whispered, "Who are you?" the figures turned, not to look, but to listen. The light around them pulsed gently, almost in greeting. Then they dissolved again into mist, leaving the air faintly warmer, as though the world had exhaled. When Eshin woke, Nayara described what she had seen. He listened silently, his hand tracing circles in the dust. "They're not gone," he said finally. "They've only changed their way of being heard." They spent the rest of the day mapping the city. Beneath certain domes, they found chambers filled with smooth crystal plates that resonated faintly when light passed over them. Some emitted low tones that shifted depending on where they stood, as if their very presence altered the song. Nayara realized that the city itself was built to amplify silence, not as emptiness, but as a form of energy. Every wall, every curve, every dome was a conduit for balance. When she stood at the heart of one hall, the hum was so even and deep that her thoughts quieted completely. She felt her heart beat slow, her breath align. She whispered, "It's listening to me." Essien nodded, smiling faintly. "Or you are listening to it." By twilight, the air grew softer. The city began to glow with a deeper warmth. gold and rose hues flowing across the stones like sunset preserved in motion. Nayara and Eshin sat together on a high terrace, gazing toward the horizon. The dunes beyond the city shimmered faintly, and for a brief moment they thought they saw movement, distant lights shifting in rhythm, like a constellation walking upon the earth. "Do you think there are other cities?" Nayara asked. "Perhaps," Essien said, "or perhaps reflections of the same one, folded through time." They watched in silence until the lights faded, replaced by the vast, breathing night. When sleep came, it was light and dreamless, the kind of rest that doesn't erase thought, but carries it forward gently. And as Nayara drifted into that state between waking and dream, she felt the city hum one last time, a slow, deep pulse. By the time Nayara and Essien left the city without shadows, the air had changed again. It carried a softness that hinted of salt, faint traces of the sea. The dunes gave way to pale, cracked plains, where small pools of still water reflected the clouds. The hum that had guided them for so long became gentler, like breath fading into distance. They walked for 7 days beneath skies that shifted from amber to gray to the pale blue of dawn. And on the 8th, they reached the edge of the ocean. It was not a loud sea. Its waves were slow and heavy, curling against the shore with the weight of centuries. The air smelled of calmness, of minerals, stone, and time. Nayara stood at the edge, watching the water lap at her feet. The tide pulled gently, and for a moment she thought she heard it whisper. Not words, but the faint rhythm of something speaking through water. Eshin stood beside her, his robe fluttering lightly in the breeze. "This sea," he said softly, "was once believed to carry the voices of those who had no graves. The people called it the sea that remembered names." Nayara's eyes followed the line of the horizon. "Do you think it remembers them still?" Eshin smiled faintly. "The sea never forgets. It only changes its way of telling." They made camp on a low rise overlooking the shore. The sky was washed in rose light, and gulls drifted like scraps of white cloth across it. Eshin began sketching the coastline, the shape of the waves, the way the tide moved in intervals, never breaking rhythm. Nayara sat beside him, tracing small spirals in the sand with her finger. The hum beneath the earth had grown almost imperceptible, yet it remained a soft, patient vibration. That night, as the tide swelled, Nayara walked to the edge again. The moon was nearly full, and its light painted silver paths across the surface. She removed her sandals, stepping into the cold water. It came to her ankles, then her knees. The sand shifted beneath her feet, and with it she felt something move, a pulse, a slow, circular vibration, as though the tide itself was breathing. She closed her eyes. The water whispered against her skin, forming small patterns of sound. Then she began to hear them, names, whispered softly, endlessly, in 1,000 forgotten tongues. Names carried by waves, erased and remade with every motion. She listened for a long time, until the sound no longer frightened her. It was not sorrowful, it was not haunting, it was remembrance, soft, infinite, kind. When she returned to the camp, Essien was awake, watching the moon. "I heard them," she said quietly. "Names carried by the tide." He nodded as though expecting it. "This sea has no graves. It keeps what the world lets go." Nayara sat beside him, her hair damp, her tone hushed. They sounded like music, but not made by anyone, just alive. "The ancients here," Eshin said, "used the tide to record memory. they placed small shells, shaped to catch sound, at the edge of the shore. Each time a wave passed over, it left an imprint of the voices it carried. When the tide withdrew, the shells whispered back. Nayara turned toward the water, eyes wide. "Are they still here, perhaps?" he said. "If the sea remembers, it may still speak through them." The next morning, they began their search. The beach stretched endlessly in both directions, smooth sand, scattered stones, faint glimmers of shells, half buried by time. Nayara walked slowly, letting the wind and rhythm guide her. Each shell she picked up hummed differently. Some were silent, some carried faint tonal memory, but one, small, pearlescent, cracked near its edge, vibrated with a deeper rhythm. When she placed it near her ear, she didn't hear a name. She heard a chorus, hundreds of voices, rising and falling like waves, layered perfectly in tone. She carried it to her father. "Listen." He pressed it to his ear, his eyes softening as he heard it too. "It's not a single memory," he said. "It's all of them woven together. The sea doesn't remember individuals. It remembers the harmony they became." Nayara smiled faintly, her gaze still on the horizon. "Then maybe that's what we all are." They stayed for several days, mapping the rhythm of the tides. Each day, the waves came in a little stronger, as though responding to their listening. At sunset, Nayara noticed something new. Certain stones at the far edge of the shore glowed faintly when the tide touched them. She waded out to one. Its surface was covered in lines, flowing inscriptions etched long ago. When the water reached it, the lines shimmered. She whispered to her father, "It's reading the sea." Eshin joined her, tracing the carvings gently. This entire coast may have been a library. Each stone a sentence written in motion. That night, as the tide receded, the sea fell silent for a while. The air grew cool, heavy with salt and quiet. Then, faintly, the hum beneath the sand began to change tone, slower, deeper. It felt like something turning, aligning. Nayara sat upright. "It's the same resonance from the temple. It's calling." Essien nodded. "Then there's more beneath us, something waiting to be heard." They began to dig the next morning, near the glowing stones. After hours of work, their tools struck a smooth surface, not rock, but a carved shell the size of a dome. It was hollow, and its surface bore spirals so intricate they looked like sound waves carved into stone. When the tide returned that evening, it flowed into the cracks of the dome, filling it slowly. Then, without warning, the air around them began to hum a resonance that rose from the water itself. The sea sang, not in melody, but in pure vibration, tones that shimmered like threads of light. Eshin and Nayara stood still, their breath slow. The hum grew until they could feel it in their ribs, in their hearts, in the spaces between thought. Then, from within the dome, a soft voice emerged, neither human nor divine, but collective. All things that listen become part of what is heard. The voice faded with the tide, leaving only the slow roll of waves. Nayara whispered, "It remembers even us." Essien smiled. "Then we have become its newest story." For 3 more nights, they stayed by the sea. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They simply listened to the tide, the shifting shells, the low hum beneath their feet. When they finally left, the water rose one last time, curling softly around their footprints before smoothing them away. And for a long while afterward, beyond the sea that remembered names, the land rose in slow, undulating waves, not hills exactly, but immense folds of stone that seemed carved by centuries of patient wind. The air was thinner here, more crystalline. Even sound carried differently. When Nayara spoke, her voice seemed to move outward, spiraling softly into the open sky. They followed a faint path lined with shards of obsidian, dark and glinting. The shards were warm to the touch, as if they had held sunlight for 1,000 years and were still reluctant to let it go. Essian walked in silence beside his daughter, his staff tracing soft patterns in the dust. He no longer carried maps. He no longer needed them. The rhythm of their steps had become the path itself. After several days of walking, the horizon opened into a plain of light, a circular depression nearly 2 miles wide, filled not with water or sand, but shimmering reflection. At its center lay a series of vast, round wells, each one smooth, rimmed with stone that gleamed faintly like silver, even under the pale afternoon sun. Nayara stopped and whispered, "They're mirrors." Eshin studied them quietly. "Not mirrors," he said. "Collectors." They approached the first well cautiously. As Nayara leaned over its edge, she expected to see her reflection. Instead, she saw a sky endless and deep, yet not quite the same as the one above her. It was darker, bluer, as though she were looking not at the sky itself, but at memory of the sky. She blinked. The image rippled faintly, then returned. Eshin knelt beside her, lowering a small stone into the well. It fell silently, yet after a few seconds, a soft sound returned, not a splash, but a tone, low, resonant, infinite. Nayara listened, her breath slow. "It sounds like the ocean, but it's coming from the air." Essian nodded. "The ancients must have shaped these two gathered lights the way the sea gathered sound." He placed his palm gently on the rim. They called them sky wells. They believed that starlight carried memory, not of people, but of moments. The light that touched them was the echo of what the universe once saw. At nightfall, the plain transformed. The stars emerged in vast constellations, and one by one, the wells began to glow. Not brightly, softly, like bowls filled with breathing moonlight. Each shimmered in a different hue: silver, blue, rose, and faint gold. The air was utterly still. Nayara and Eshin stood between them, bathed in the quiet luminescence. The wells began to hum, faint at first, then rising into layered harmony, a chorus of light. Nayara whispered, "It's the same tone, but higher." Essian looked upward. "It's as if the stars are responding." Above them, faint trails of light moved, not shooting stars, but slow drifts, like rivers of fire weaving across the sky. As they passed overhead, the tones from the wells shifted, aligning perfectly with their movement. They stayed there until midnight. Eshin sat cross-legged beside one well, eyes closed, letting the rhythm settle through him. Nayara wandered between the circles, her steps soundless. Every time she moved, the light responded, dimming slightly, then returning brighter, as though acknowledging her presence. At the farthest well, she paused. The light within it shimmered differently, fractured, almost restless. When she leaned closer, she saw faint shapes moving deep within, shadows made of light, forming and dissolving. She reached out her hand, not to touch, but to listen. A pulse answered, faint, familiar. It was the same tone she had felt in the listening temple, the city without shadows, and the sea that remembered names. But now it had changed, slower, heavier, carrying something like memory. Essian's voice broke the stillness. "It's all the same pattern, Nayara. The earth, the sea, the sky, all resonating in sequence." She nodded, eyes still on the light. Maybe they were never separate. Listen. Eshin traced the lines thoughtfully. Perhaps this place wasn't built to worship the stars, but to learn to hear them. Nayara smiled softly. Maybe light was their language. At dusk, the wind began to move slow, sweeping currents that passed gently across the plain. As it touched the wells, the light rippled, the tones returned, harmonic, serene, endless. The whole plain began to breathe. These wells, he said, were made to remind us that light doesn't only reveal, it remembers. Nayara smiled faintly, the wind tugging at her hair. Then we'll carry its memory until it finds voice again. They turned east, their shadows long and soft on the pale plain. And as they walked, the faint hum followed, steady, patient, infinite. The road to the highlands was made of silence. For days, Nayara and Oralan walked without words, only the sound of sandals over brittle dust and the breath of thin air. The dunes had long fallen away behind them. The wind that once hummed through Paracana's hollow towers had faded into the patient stillness of stone. The mountains stood before them now, an ancient shape, carved not by gods, but by time itself. From its base rose terraces that shimmered faintly under dawn's pale light, as though memory itself had settled upon its surface like dust. No one lived here anymore. The elders had called it Amarukuna, the sleeping serpent, the place where the sky had once touched the earth. But those who came seeking its secrets had long since turned back, frightened not by what they found, but by what they did not. When Nayara placed her hand upon the first stone, she felt warmth, not heat, but something alive. The stone vibrated faintly beneath her fingers, as if breathing through the weight of centuries. Orellan watched her quietly. "The air feels heavier here," he murmured. "It's not air," she replied. "It's remembrance." They ascended, slowly. The steps were worn smooth by time, their edges soft like language forgotten by the tongue. Every few paces, Nayara would pause to listen, not for wind or birds, but for that same subtle hum that had followed her since the city's nights of spiral light. It was stronger here, clearer, no longer a sound, but a presence, vast, slow, and kind. It seemed to pulse from within the mountain itself, like the heart of the world dreaming beneath its ribs. By the second day, mist rolled from the western cliffs, wrapping the slopes in white veils. Nayara and Orellan found shelter beneath an overhang, where the stone walls were etched with spirals, eyes, and long winding forms, the same symbols she had once traced in the night sky. "These markings," she whispered, "they mirror the constellations, but there are more of them." Orellan touched one carefully, tracing the curves of a carved serpent whose scales formed tiny patterns of stars. "Perhaps they recorded what the heavens became," he said softly, "not what they were." That thought lingered. The air grew thinner, and with it their thoughts became weightless, not delirious, but distant, like whispers remembered in sleep. At night they lay beneath the open sky, where the stars appeared closer than ever, so close they seemed to hum through the stones. Nayara could not tell whether she was awake or dreaming, But she began to hear the mountain's voice, low, rhythmic, endless. It spoke not in words, but in intervals of stillness. She thought of the old mosaic in Paracana, the field of eyes, the inscription about silence and light. Here, in the mountain's embrace. On the third morning, the mists cleared, revealing a narrow path carved into the cliffside. At its end stood a great stone door, half buried in vines, untouched by tools or time. Its surface shimmered faintly in the sun, the minerals within glinting like dusted starlight. Nayara brushed her hand over its cold surface. The humming ceased. Then, slowly, a vibration rose from deep within, resonating through the ground, through her feet, through her chest. The door did not open, yet something within her did. She closed her eyes. Images unfolded across her mind. Rivers of molten rock cooling into land, winds carving valleys, the first seeds growing in silence. She saw the mountain not as it stood now, but as it was becoming an unending act of creation. The hum grew softer, resolving into a pattern she had heard once before, in her dreams, in the stars, in the stillness of the dunes. It was the same rhythm that guided her pulse. For a moment, she understood the stars were not above or beyond. They were within the mountain, within every stone, within every breath. The heavens had never left the earth. They had merely turned inward. Aurelin's voice reached her faintly. "What is it?" She turned to him, her eyes distant yet calm. "It's not a temple," she said. "It's a sleeper." The mountain dreamed, and in its dreaming, the world held form. They sat there for hours, listening. No need to speak. The stone beneath them vibrated with a pulse slower than time. It felt eternal, patient, and forgiving. She realized then that perhaps all civilizations were the mountain's thoughts, that Paracana, the city, the spirals, the people, they were not architects of meaning, but moments within the mountain's long, unbroken dream. As dusk fell, the stars returned, faint, scattered, yet perfectly aligned above the summit. Their reflection shimmered faintly across the stone door, as though mirrored from within. Nayara and Aurelon climbed the final slope until they reached the crest, a plateau where the air was impossibly clear. There stood a circle of stones, each shaped like a pillar, each bearing a faint etching of constellations now vanished from the sky. At the center was a single depression filled with fine silver sand. When Nayara knelt beside it, the sand began to move, forming ripples like water. From beneath, a soft glow emerged, not bright, but alive. Aurelin stepped back in awe. "Is it light?" She smiled faintly. "No, it's memory." The light pulsed gently, taking form patterns, faces, waves of movement, resembling wind through tall grass. She could see Paracana's towers, the faces of its children, the nights of the listening stars. The mountain remembered everything. Tears blurred her sight, but she did not look away. She whispered softly, "We were never forgotten, were we?" The mountain's hum deepened, not an answer, but a reassurance. It felt like the touch of a mother's hand over sleeping eyes. They remained until night swallowed the plateau. The light within the sand dimmed, leaving only the sky, immense, wordless, eternal. When Nayara finally rose, she felt no sorrow, no wonder, only peace. Her life's question had dissolved into the mountain's slow exhale. She turned to Aurelin. "Do you hear it still?" He nodded. "Always. It doesn't stop now, not even inside." They descended slowly, the stars guiding their steps, the hum of the mountain following like a second heartbeat. Below, the desert stretched endless, soft as sleep. Paracana awaited, its towers now faint silhouettes beneath the moon. As they reached the valley floor, Nayara looked back once more at the sleeping mountain. For the first time, she noticed how its ridges mirrored the very spirals carved in her clay tablets, the same pattern that linked city to sky. Dawn rose slowly across the valley, not in brilliance, but in silence. The first light touched the stone terraces of Paracana, where the wind had returned after many moons of stillness. It moved through the empty courtyards like a remembering breath, soft, unhurried, older than human time. Nayara walked alone through the morning haze, her steps tracing the familiar rhythm of the city that had once listened to the stars. The spiral patterns carved into the streets glimmered faintly under dew, and the air smelled of stone warmed by sleep. She had returned from the mountain changed, though nothing about her seemed outwardly different. Her hands still bore the faint dust of travel, her eyes still followed the sky. But inside, the questions that had once stirred her heart had fallen silent, not with answers, but with peace. At the foot of the central observatory, she paused. The great dome, cracked but proud, faced east, its shadow stretching across the plaza like an open arm. Aurelin sat nearby, tracing lines in the sand with a stick, the same patterns they had seen on the mountain's surface. "Do you think it still dreams?" he asked softly. Nayara looked toward the horizon, where the mountain's outline shimmered faintly through the morning mist. "It never stopped," she said. "We were the dream, and we've simply awakened inside it." He nodded slowly, letting the sand slip through his fingers. "Then what happens now?" She smiled, that small, inward kind of smile that carried no joy or sadness, only understanding. "Now," she said, "we learn to listen again." Days passed like breaths. The people of Paracana returned to their lives, weaving, teaching, tending to the wells, but their voices had softened. They no longer shouted across the streets. They spoke as if aware of an unseen listener. The wind that moved through the city carried a hum, gentle, resonant, like the fading echo of the mountain's pulse. Every evening, Nayara climbed to the high terrace to write, but she no longer charted the heavens or recorded equations of movement. Her clay tablets now held only lines of empty circles, spirals, and small marks between them, the intervals of silence that spoke more than any word. One night, as the moon rose behind drifting clouds, Nayara heard a familiar sound, faint flute tones carried from the southern dunes. It was the same melody she had heard as a child, before her first lessons, when Paracana had still been full of laughter and sky festivals. But now the song felt older, slower, more complete. She followed the sound beyond the walls, where the sand met stone. There she found a young boy, sitting alone, playing a flute carved from bone. His eyes were closed, his fingers gentle upon the holes. The melody rose and fell, like breathing. When he finished, Nayara asked softly, "Who taught you that song?" He opened his eyes and shrugged. "No one," he said. "It came in a dream." Her heart stilled. The mountain's dream, she thought, had found another voice, and so the song continued, not through her, but through the new. She watched the boy until the stars filled the sky again. Then she turned toward the city, her footsteps slow, unhurried, light upon the earth that now seemed to hum beneath her feet. That night, she lay upon the observatory's roof, eyes open to the quiet constellations above. The spiral she once mapped had faded from the heavens, replaced by gentler arcs and softer brightness. It no longer called to her, for its purpose was fulfilled. Instead, she felt it within her chest, the same curve, the same rhythm, like a heart that breathed in time with the universe. She remembered her mentor, Khaled, and his words. Perhaps we are echoes of what was sung long before the earth had sand. Now, she understood the echo was the song itself, carried endlessly through different forms, always whispering its meaning to those who listened quietly enough to hear. In the final days of the season, a gentle rain came, rare in the desert. It fell like dust turned liquid, each drop soft as breath. The terraces shimmered. The carved stones glistened, as if the city had opened its eyes. Children ran barefoot through the wet courtyards, their laughter blending with the hum of the wind. The air smelled of renewal. Arellen stood beside Nayara, beneath the colonnade, watching the water gather into small pools. "The stars have returned to the earth," he said quietly. She nodded. "They always were. We just forgot to look down." The mountain, far beyond the horizon, was half shrouded in rain clouds, not sleeping now, but exhaling mist and light, as though at last its dream had reached the open air. That night, as she prepared to rest, Nayara sat beside her window and looked once more at the heavens. There was no sign, no omen, no mystery left to solve. Only the quiet pulse of the stars and the still rhythm of her own breathing. She whispered, "May the sky remember softly." The wind entered through the window, curling around her words and carrying them outward over rooftops, over dunes, over mountains, until they vanished into the great quiet beyond. The city listened. The desert listened. Even the stars seemed to pause. And for one long moment, the world itself breathed. Good night, listener. May your thoughts drift like the desert wind that forgets nothing. May your dreams be gentle as mountains in sleep, and may you wake where silence hums with life. The stars have spoken enough. Now they rest, and so may you.